some teaching on neurology, I think my primary motivation is that because the uh, Neijing models are sort of the kind of big models on which I put everything else. I want to have a conversation about what I'm learning, and I want to know your thoughts on some of these things, and I want to know what it triggers for you and how it fits in. Like, I'm not going to, I can look at things and see some relevance and go, that's interesting, but I'm not going to get so far on my own. But if I can present to you what I'm learning, and some of it, I'm sure you already know from your training. I mean, but other things, I'm like, well, this like what would some cross pollination look like?
Let's do it.
I mean,
Um,
I think maybe for the purposes of this, and also just to help me learn it better, selfishly, um, I might start putting together a slide deck, and so that can, really crystallize it. But just, I mean, there's just a couple of themes that come up. I mean, one is that if you understand the body as terrain, then learning everything is a lot easier. You put with the Neijing perspective, you put more of a focus on blood and water. So, like, I think I've mentioned this to you before, but I've done a number of neurology trainings, and they kind of it's a little bit like if we're looking at a map, we just kind of a lot of unless you're a sailor, you don't really give a shit about the water. You're just looking at the land,
right.
or if you're a hydrologist, and it's sort of like that. It's like the uh, the bits of anatomy that go around cerebral spinal fluid, it's just we only care about the anatomy, and I'm like, oh, interesting. It's like surrounding this like aquifer. It's surrounding this water. The body must have thought it was important for those two things to be close to one another, and I'm aware of the cerebral spinal fluid, amongst other things, as being a way to um, carry infrared photons around. So I'm like,
Yes.
interesting.
And remember in the Neijing, in Western thought, we have one kind of water. It's called H2O. But in Chinese thinking, we have many, many kinds of water, and they all have different properties. And so, one question is, what is the special property of CSF fluid? Like we say, blood is red water, and then there's water that moves through your tissue planes. But CSF is some kind of very precious protected water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and, just as, like, I don't know, a silly example, there's a piece of neuroanatomy called the periaqueductal gray, and I've, heard of that for quite a while, and it's associated with different diseases. That's what everything's just associated with the disease, PAG, but I'm like, "Oh, periaqueductal gray." It's gray matter that goes around this aqueduct, and that's why it's called that, and so if we and as I'm thinking about teaching neurology, it has a lot of the same challenges as Neijing medicine, but also can be overcome in a similar way. In the way that you teach Neijing medicine, a similar approach can be taken to neurology. So one of the biggest hurdles. Hey, could I make an executive decision and just turn this episode into a discussion about neurology? Because we're just
Let's do it.
come on, why not? It'll be just be raw and ready because I've just got it on the brain, and I'm like thinking about these questions I want to ask you, and people can just be
Let's go.
so.
Let's go.
All right, all right, um, yeah. So one of those things is the terms and language, right? And that's like one of the biggest barriers, and it's similar for both studies. So for Chinese medicine, first, for people who are not Chinese native speakers, there's this barrier that people don't speak Chinese. But then we have to go further. It's actually classical Chinese. It's not even regular Chinese. So even fewer people understand that. But then we're not done. There's another layer, which is the like kind of frame of reference of the people who wrote it and what was their worldview. And so, what do these terms really mean? Um, and there's a similar thing, maybe to a lesser extent, with studying neurology, because probably the biggest barrier is the terminology, that there's so many words. And unless you've great teachers, like, you're an excellent teacher of this. If you don't have an excellent teacher of that, it's an undifferentiated pile of facts and terms, and it's insurmountable. And but if you know some really important basic foundational ways that it's organized, then it's a different game. And then they're just words.
Right. I remember anatomy, which should be like the most fascinating thing, is often the most boring thing because it seems like it's just a pile of disconnected things you have to memorize. And there's nothing that puts it together, exactly like you're saying. And, the naming is so critical, and we're not very good with words these days. Words have fluid meanings. We don't actually know what they mean. There's a lot less thinking in a literary sense, I think, than there used to be. But in early Chinese philosophy and writings, in the Confucius school, there was this concept called zhengming, and zheng means ordered or correct. It means the way nature flows when it's well. That spring follows winter and summer follows spring. So it's a kind of a dance of motion in the correct way. And it also means upright and correct. And then Ming means naming. And one of the central ideas of this is that things start to go wrong when we name things wrong. So in the Confucian text, they say, if you don't have the zhengming of a term, if you don't know what a word means, then affairs start going wrong, and that the misunderstanding of words is really at the heart of how many things go wrong. Like when we misname ourselves. For example,
Mhm.
if I said I was a neurologist, but I'm not, all sorts of things would go wrong. Or if I said I was head of a CEO, CEO or something, all sorts of things would go wrong. So there's this way that the naming, it's not just about names, it's an essential important thing. It's like a root from which things can grow from, and if we name things correctly, then really healthy things can grow from that.
That
Um,
that gets I mean, that gets it to the heart. We'll probably end up doing a lot of back and forth between neurology and, classical Chinese medicine because 'cause I've got both on the brain, at the moment. But one of because I've been reading, scientific literature around the brain for a very long time, and it's amazing how confused I've been for so long. Um, and a lot of it is around naming. So, one big thing is that there's no convention and no differentiation around the level of specificity of the part of the brain that you're talking about. So, if I were to give an analogy, let's say what I'm writing about is the right pinky finger. And sometimes when I write a study, I'll call this the right pinky finger. And sometimes I'll call it the right arm. And sometimes I'll just talk about arms. That's super confusing. That's like super confusing because, like the periaqueductal gray that I just mentioned, like that's in the midbrain. But most studies won't mention that. So you don't know where things are. Like you don't know where things live or exist or the relationship unless you've studied it for years. But that's kind of unnecessary. It's almost like they need to have breadcrumbs so that again, it's all about mapping, that if you know like the big parts and then specific, 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 then you always know sort of where you are.
and that goes back to this basic thing we're always talking about, that there's two dimensions we live in, and one is the thing-based world, and one is the process-based world. And if you know the process-based world, then you understand how the things are organized. But if you don't, if you only know the part-based world, it's just a collection of parts. So, for example, in classical text archaeology, we work really hard. It's really focused on what characters mean, with that idea of Zhengming. Because if we talk about a character like Qi or something, and we don't really even know what it means, is it electricity or energy or whatever, then everything's off from there, basically. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what the character can mean. As soon as you name something, it's really interesting though. As soon as you name something, it becomes less true in a certain way. It's like when we have that in the Tao Te Ching where it says, if you the name that can be spoken is not the true name. And it's the naming of something that shifts it from the process based world of breath and motion to the part based world. And one of the analogies of this is in the dual slit experiment in physics that was done in the 1920s or maybe 30s. I can't remember. Do you know that experiment?
I know. Well, I know the experiment. I was trying to decide if I knew what decade it had been done.
Oh, okay. The quantum mechanics, it kind of arose in the 20s. I can't remember exactly when this was done, but Basically, you're sending a coherent source of light, and it has through two slits, and it can form a wave interference pattern when it goes through, showing that light is like a wave. But as soon as you put up something to measure it, it turns into a thing, a particle, and you see a particle on the receiving part. That's the shorthand of it. And it's the giving it a name part that shifts it from one dimension to the other. So in a way, so we have this saying, like the highest use of words is to illuminate the world without words. Remember, that's one of the sayings we're going to have on a coffee cup soon in our store.
Totally.
That
I'm wondering if that phenomenon that you just mentioned about naming something as almost being like a collapsing function for the thing, where it goes from being a process to a thing. I'm kind of wondering if that happens less in pictographic languages and more in alphabet like languages, that there's
I
maybe like a
I'm
spectrum.
sure it does, because when we're looking at Chinese characters, we're seeing not just sound. English is a collection of things that mean sounds, not images now. So, but when we look at Chinese, we're seeing complex images that still relate. So they're showing us. So, for example, Ming, a character for illuminate, is a picture of the sun and the moon. So we still see that. The thing is, so it's not that we don't want to use words, because words allow us to navigate the world of things. And the Tao Te Ching says, both the dimension of process and the dimension of things is sacred. They come from the same source, but they're different manifestations. So it's not that the thing based world is wrong. And for example, if we see someone with cancer, we see the thing of the tumor, that gives us lots of information. We can start there. But that we want to understand that things start with processes. So the other thing, for example, with neuroanatomy, is if we live in the thing based world, then it's just a collection of things, and it's very confusing, right? If you start with the process based world, then all those things have structure. And like you're saying, when you start looking at words carefully, then there's all these levels of meaning that we're not aware of. Like you said, the aqueduct, well, no one thinks of, is that an aqueduct? What does that mean? Or take the word inspirational. It means to take a breath, inspire. So when you start thinking about words, there's a lot more depth in them. But the other thing is, if you understand the process of the process based world, the thing based world is forming around the process based world. That's one of the main principles. So, just like how water would carve out a canyon, it's actually, for the early Chinese thing, it's about the water that flows through and makes the space. And it's the space that's important. And the thing is the side of the space, do you know? So, even in embryology, for example, when we look at how the embryo starts to form in the blastocyst very early, it's about the patterns of river motion around which the cells begin to form. And I bet that's the same in the nervous system.
I You know what? That's a great question, and I bet it is. That's sort of something that needs to be either more researched, or I'll take a dive into it. One of the things that you mentioned about like anatomy is almost like a pile of parts versus processes. One of the big things that comes up over and over again, and I mean, I just think that probably a very small percentage of even like neuroscientists understand this, is that the one way to put it is like the feeding pattern and the developmental pattern of the brain is bottom up and center out. And okay, that's maybe, I don't know if that sounds profound or not, but there's so much of a focus on the outermost bit. It's like everyone's focused on the fruit of the tree, but not on the roots, because that's not the sexy part, and it doesn't look like much is happening. And so what follows from that is that there's a huge explosion in uh, either techniques or tools or therapeutics, really focusing on this outer bit, which is the human bit, the executive function, the rational brain, the human brain, all these exciting things that'll give you a better IQ score. But that is really coming from the like unsung hero back here, and gives you this, again, this pattern of understanding the neuroanatomy, which is straight out of the Neijing. It's also a little bit straight out of common sense, which we're trying to make popular again. But if you just pick up a paper, you're not going to find that sort of basic foundational knowledge, and yet it's so important.
because we think that's who we are. We associate ourselves with our brain, which is in the Neijing, that's not true. The brain does one thing, the heart does another, your body does another, and so forth. So once you understand the process versus the thing-based world, you understand sort of a sequence of how things are ordered. And then we study nature to examine nature's design. And we find basic patterns in nature's design that we can spread across all different things. So we know things come from patterns, then they turn into things, but they do that along certain principles of nature's design. And of course, one is that roots, fruit grows from roots, branches grow from roots. And that's deeply embedded in every emotion in the universe. So if you understand that, like you're saying, it's not about the cortex so much, but the root is in the back of the brain,
Mm,
and things are spreading out from that. The other thing is that we see things like Jing and Lo patterns, which means things growing axially or in one straight line towards a goal, and things then spreading out to the side. So there's all different parts of nature's design that as soon as you get that pattern language, then you understand the pattern of how the brain would develop. And then when you are labeling things, they're on that, like the cortex is like the outer leaves and branches of that tree. And the back of the brain is the root of that tree. And the spinal cord is the deeper root or something like that. And also, the other important thing is in the Neijing, it's all about the water essentially. So, like they say, how do you know someone's healthy? It's that the water or the blood is moving well. So, the water is somehow sacred to all of this, which in the brain is the CSF, because it's the water that's carrying the breath pattern of unfoldment in it, that around which the things are forming. So, if we go back to look at the embryology of the brain, we're probably going to see that the fluid is very important in the development of that. I'm not an expert in that, but maybe you know more about that. But once you get that pattern language down, then you can walk into anything and say, "This is what's happening." You can walk into a corporation or an ICU or a preschool, and it's the same patterns.
I think I'd say like in defense, I said before that there's a kind of this just completely ignoring or underappreciation for this natural pattern that we see everywhere, and sort of in defense of neurology, I think the process of discovery went in reverse. So you'd have someone like Phineas Gage who is an upstanding citizen and then gets his like his head kind of impaled and he loses function.
I don't know if everybody knows that story. You want to
Yeah,
tell
okay, so this is, like, one of the quintessential stories of modern psychology or, like, neuropsychology. Phineas Gage was a rail worker, and at that time, you needed to put together, like, a bit of, like, explosive to tampen down nails to build the railroad, and he kinda misgauged his, his explosives, and basically the iron this iron kinda went through his head, like through his orbital frontal cortex and then out. And I think he kind of mainly stayed conscious, or roughly. And so he survived this, but he had like a
hole through his
huge.
head.
What was that?
He had
Yeah,
a hole
but
through
he
his
had a
head.
hole through his head, or a bit, two. Um, but he had personality changes, right? So associated with not having a very highly functioning right orbitofrontal cortex. So he started like being unreliable and drinking and philandering and all these things. Um, but and also we see that in other places where someone has a certain level of function and then they have a stroke or they have an injury and we see that loss of function. And so that's a reasonable reason for the field at large to focus on these higher structures, for sure. And I'm not saying that they're irrelevant by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that it, the understanding of hierarchy and natural patterns is probably the thing that's most missing from everything. And it's about understanding the relative importance of information and of things. So that, yes, of course, those outer areas of your brain are important and they give rise to really advanced function. But what's missing is an understanding of, first of all, of development. So if you have like a child whose brain isn't developing properly, rather than focusing all of your effort out here, you're going to probably get somewhere faster, by focusing at the brainstem and cerebellum, which are research definitely shows are not working well in those kids. But then there's something in between, right? There's something in between having a head injury or a railroad iron through your skull, and then being a kid with a neurodevelopmental diagnosis, which is like, let's just say you're a regular adult. Well, why don't we start with how is your root doing? You know, how is your brainstem doing? How is your cerebellum doing? How are these lower functions doing? Great. How are the outer functions doing? Because if the lower functions are not doing well, the outer functions are not going to be doing well. So just because you find that you're having trouble adulting or you need to use adult as a verb because these bits aren't working well, that's going to be true for everyone who's struggling. Now, the kind of, to me, the first things first, the hierarchical approach that we get from understanding basic natural patterns is start down here. And if that's all fine, then great. Then let's just put a laser here or do whatever, brain training, whatever you're thinking to do. But if these bits aren't working well, which they often aren't, then that's really the first things first.
And that goes back to a basic concept in Chinese medicine, not even Neijing medicine, but standard Chinese medicine, which is root and branch treatments. So when someone comes in with cancer or another illness, there's a root from which the cancer arose, which we work very hard to understand and form a treatment for. But there are also branch expressions. So, for example, you might have a cancer that's spread to your brain and you can't speak. And that's not the root cause, but it's a branch expression. So, in a blended treatment, we're always moving back and forth between root and branch. So, if the person comes in with cancer and not speaking is their main issue, we might focus more on branch symptoms. Or if we have more time, say someone had breast cancer, was taken out, now we're going to understand, well, where did this come from? Let's keep it from happening again. So in clinic, we're always switching back and forth, but we always have this understanding that in nature, fruits and branches come from roots. And so that allows us to organize all the information.
Yeah, that's very cool. Now, there's
Yeah.
a question. This is a question that I've probably asked you a number of times, but it's an ongoing question. It's like an open question, right? So I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, partly because I want the nation to conform to my learning. No, I'll be honest. I'm not going to make it do that. But this is an ongoing question, which is this: that I've learned from you that the Neijing describes the terrain of the body in breathtaking detail, and one aspect of that is looking at different tissue types and tissue layers. And I've also learned from you that there isn't really a specific word for nerve in the Neijing. That it does mention the brain quite a bit now, which I'm not going to do my lack of Chinese intonation, but NAO in pinyin. Um, so it does mention the brain, but there isn't a specific uh, word for nerves. But then, so just to kind of continue the conversation, the level of detail that they describe things in the body sh- reflects what they could see, right? That they were looking, definitely looking inside of bodies, no question, and they were mapping things out, but like in a breathtaking detail. And you can see nerves when you open a body. So to me, it seems implausible that they like didn't know it was there. They were there because they could see them, and that they didn't include them or mention them. So my hypothesis is that maybe they included them in a category of a different term. So I want to pose this question because what one hypothesis is that they just didn't mention them at all. That they wrote this really detailed description of how the body works and they left out nerves, which based on the level of sophistication, to me, it doesn't seem that plausible. Um, another possibility, but again, this is coming from someone who doesn't know very much Chinese, that maybe they did use it a different term. But the third one that I'm kind of leaning towards, based on your previous answers to this question, is that maybe it's incorporated in something like sinews, which we talk about specific definitions. That when you talk about what sinews do, according to that, that could include nerves. So I don't want to. I want to. I'll stop talking in a second. I don't want to twist the Neijing into my modern understanding, but to me, it seems implausible that they would leave out extensive anatomy that they could see.
Yeah, it's a good question. You're right that they don't really talk about nerves in the way we would think that they would, that they, where do they go and so forth. There is another term, marrow, which sometimes we think, well, maybe that included nerves. But they don't really talk about nerves in the same way. They don't talk about the difference in nervous and vascular pathways, for example. And what was I going to say? When you edit this out, I just lost my train of thought here. And they do talk about things like the do my, which is really going to be the spinal cord area, and they talk about things, for example, they'll say, like, if you flick the back of the elbow, you'll feel a zingy pain down your finger, and so there's that. And it may have been that they were just focused more on things that were carrying things like blood. So, for example, if you stick a straw up a blood vessel, you'll see where it goes, but you don't see that with a nerve. And maybe they thought it was part of a membrane or something. Um, so it's not really clear. What's kind of important in text research is, as you say, is not to make them say something. So do you remember, I don't know, in our class we talk about in text archaeology, there's the different boxes we have
Yeah.
when we find something. And one is the box where we think we kind of know what it means. One is that we know it, we absolutely know we don't know what it means at all. The other is we kind of think we know what it means, maybe a little bit, something. And the fourth box is the biggest box, which is we're even unaware that there's a question there, you know? And so we have to have this fluidity because, and to battle our tendency to want to name things. Do you remember the other quote I use all the time is questions, not answers?
Yes.
And the reason is because answers fix things in the same way that naming does. And
Yeah.
our brain doesn't like uncertainty. It takes effort to live with uncertainty. It's a skill you can develop and you move through the world in a much more beautiful and rich way. That's the same thing when we say in the clinic, it's not about the answers for the patient's problems, it's about the questions. Um, and so it's really important not to say, well, this was probably a nerve when we don't know for sure it was.
Mhm.
What we can say is that there was a hierarchy of anatomical creation, and that hierarchy starts with patterns of breath motion that are in rhythmic coherences that move up and down with the sun or whatever, and that forms around those things. And the forming around the space, we call it graining patterns. And the graining patterns carry rivers and other things, like sinews also go in the same kind of general patterns, and that they go in Jing and Lo patterns. So we can say that and when we look at the body in Western medicine, we talk about neurovascular bundles.
Yeah.
And so it can also be that they thought it might be part of a blood vessel system. Do you know? But why do we call it neurovascular bundles? It's because they run in the same graining patterns. So that hierarchy of how things are made is there. Um, but it's hard to kind of say that's what they were saying a nerve was, and we don't want to force them to do that. What we can't say is they thought about the brain in a different way. And that's a very interesting topic. I don't know if we want to get into that
We
today.
do. We do.
Okay. So that this is also a very basic question. What does a modern person think the brain is? And what did an early Chinese person, what was the role of the brain? Do you remember, you probably heard in Chinese medicine that the people thought that the brain was a kind of marrow
Yes.
and that it didn't really have special things, special, like it didn't have this special power that we give it today. And for example, some kind of nose drips were called brain drip, for example. Um, and so what was the role of the brain? And what is the brain? So if the brain is a marrow, it comes from the kidney root in Chinese medicine, and it's a deep yin substance. Why would you have a big ball of yin on top of your head, essentially? What would its job be? Do you know? What can yin do? It can receive yang. If there's no yin in a certain space, yang can't be received. It's just going to bounce around and move, but it's not really going to entrain or do anything. Why would you have this big ball of marrow up on the top of your head? It's where your sense organs are. And the sense organs are receiving a lot of yang stimulus like colors, flashes, lights, sounds, smells. And the ball of marrow is there to receive those yin impulses so that when the ball of marrow becomes depleted, the signs are you can't see, you can't hear. It's not that you can't think. So in early Chinese thinking, thought and identity came from your heart. So the brain was a receiver of impulses, but it didn't know how to make sense of anything. It's just there to receive impulses. Your heart is where you live, and it's where things are made sense of. How does that happen? Your heart is at the intersection in the natural design of your body, of the planes of the body. And one of the main principles in the Neijing is that there's this dimension of light woven into space time that periodically emerges out of that fabric. When it's in the fabric, it's called Shen. When it's out of the fabric, it's called Shen Ming, or the illumination of Shen. Shen is the light, the transcendent light. When the light emerges, the world starts to organize itself, the universe starts to organize itself. So, in the body and the intersection, that happens, it comes out of the fabric where yin and yang breath, motions are in a dynamic state of balance. So that happens at the intersection in your body in terms of nature's design. And that's a place where light emanates by nature of the quality of space time there. And the light comes out and starts to organize your body. So, how do you, and that's who you are. You are that light. You're not your elbow, you're not your ear. You're that light. And when that light goes away and your heartbeat stops, you disappear and your body becomes kind of this pile of meat again. Um, so, how do we know things with our heart? So, heart knowing tells us the value of something, brain knowing tells us the details. How does heart knowing work? It means that if we feel the light of our heart and we're moving through situations in the world, we can compare them to the light in our heart. And it's the light of our heart that tells us the value of it. So, say I'm with a new friend and I want to know, should I continue to be this person's friend? One way I can do it is through heart knowing. I think of the friend or the situation, whatever it is. I feel the light in my heart and I feel the resonance between those two things. And if the light in my heart kind of lightens up, that's a decision. I'm going to see that friend. If it's diminished or somehow off putting, I'm going to move away from that. So there's really big, in Western thinking, it's really different. So somewhere along when we got words, which is not that long ago, and started telling stories, and words are still the main actor here, by the way. We started to tell stories about ourselves, and we started to become aware of ourselves, which is what I call self-referential awareness.
And
And
is that not where the term Homo sapiens sapiens comes from, right?
yeah, like knowing, the knowing people, right? But the knowing means knowing about yourself because, my cat knows about the world, a cloud knows about the world. It moves in perfect with this very complex harmony. And that's what we call circulatory or immersive intelligence. But somehow, when words came, just like that story about Adam and Eve, I think we've talked about before, when they took the bite of the apple, it was the bite of apple of knowledge. The knowledge was of themselves. All of a sudden, they realized they were naked. They somehow had this understanding of themselves as different from nature. And that was the problem. So, when we talk about consciousness now, when in the brain, we're usually when you hear people talk about consciousness, they're most often talking about self referential awareness. And that means I'm aware of myself and I start using words to tell stories about myself. And when that happens, the brain starts to appear to be the locus of where we live, right? But what's happened in that shift is we've lost heart knowing. And just recently, in the last 20 years, 15 years, with the rise of social media and AI, and this has really kind of blossomed and bloomed in a whole different way. And in many ways, we're not prepared for it. as human beings. So that's why we'll go back to say, well, this is why we focus on the cortex, because that's where we think we live. But we live in a whole body, of which the brain is a part. It's just taken these steps to where certain parts of the brain are preeminent. So, for example, that we don't see that the back of the brainstem is the root of the brain, and we don't focus on it because we think it's all out where we live. But it means, as we say, we've come to this place where we're drowning in stories and story fragments, in information, I should say, but we don't have heart-based stories with which to put the information together. So we're drowning in information on one hand, but we have where it's a desert in terms of stories that can put the information together in human-based or heart-based ways.
So this issue seems to me to be related to a question of embodiment. So that if heart-based knowing, which is what our true selves, is about this comparison that gets made, I suppose, with encountering something and then how it resonates with our hearts. But if we're up in our heads and we're not embodied, then it's almost like the brain creates a self for itself, and that we're
Right,
not
and that's why we
feeling.
have, like, things called the body-mind problem,
Yeah.
which is not a problem. It's not a thing. And what's happened recently, and really in a dizzying rate, we're changing this. And one of the things that's really changed this, I keep coming back to this, is a cell phone. Because what happens as soon as you look at a cell phone, it takes all the energy up into your higher cortical processing. It takes your energy and takes it there. And you're focusing on a world of information and words, and you're trying to make sense of it. And the lower parts of your body, why can't people sleep now? For example, every time you look at your phone or your screen, it takes the energy up to your higher cortical functioning centers, and it leaves out the rest of your body, including your heart. So we're really at a precarious point right now, trying to figure this stuff out, and it's really tricky at the moment.
Mm. I was learning some other implications of cell phone use, and I speak as someone who has a complex relationship with my own cell phone. So I'm always interested as someone who's helping other people navigate life with their own health. But I'm like kind of always, patient zero for all of my learning. But I'm learning about the cranial nerves and the brainstem, and again, not just anatomical, not just, I'm not trying to pass an exam, I'm trying to learn how to interface. And one principle that I'm learning is that if you are finding an area, this is a neurologically centric approach, right? Let's say if you're finding something's not working too well and you want to activate it, if you activate something near it, it will increase its activity. So if we know where things live and they're not working well, we can kind of activate or wake up things near them, and that'll increase flow to them, right? But when we're, our so one of the things that's controlled by our brainstem and our cranial nerves is where our eyes are pointing. And so imagine a time, a few centuries ago, a few millennia ago, where were our eyes pointing at? Well, it would have been different. I think we would have spent a lot of time in a relaxed peripheral focus. I think that would have been the default, you know. And then, of course, you can zoom in if you're acutely stressed. If we are not inside of walls, then we have a lot more going on with our long range motions, or a lot more divergence. And yeah, like there's kind of this thing going on. And also, maybe we're in community, so we're, like, chatting with people. But if we're kind of all looking at a short range distance, and converged basically. And so it's just it's like putting on a cast, neurologically speaking, if you look at it in terms of what you're doing every day on end, months on end, year on end. So now,
Ours, yeah.
and so you're basically using the nerves and muscles that are going to make the eyes do this and have this focal point. So you're neglecting the ones that go out. You're not really using the ones that make the eyes go up and down. Yeah, maybe within this screen size, and maybe on my laptop this, but not like you're outside. So you're
And
basically just with your eyes alone. Forget that you're not moving, and that you're not getting the cardio rest, but just with your eyes, you're basically completely boxing in uh, the activity, the muscular activity, and the nutrition. I say nutrition, the nourishment of blood and oxygen and light that's going to these areas is vastly diminished.
Right. And that's, as you know, tied into your vestibular system. Like normally in the old days, it's not just that your eyes would be moving, but your body would be moving in three-dimensional space, and your breathing body would be moving as a coherence. And so and your feet wouldn't be walking on pavement. And, when you look at blue zones, I mean, where people live forever, what is it? Well, they have sunlight, nice air, they good food, and they walk all the time on uneven surfaces. They're
Absolutely.
walking up hills, walking upstairs, all these kinds of things. Um, and the other thing is that, you know, where do people live now? The internet on one hand is a computer technology. On the other hand, it's a almost like a fantasy world that doesn't really exist in real world. Like when you go onto your phone, and I'm not saying phones are all bad; they're just tools. They have good and bad. Um, but you're going into a world when you wake up and you turn your phone on and you look at it, and you're going into a world that's really kind of a make believe world in a certain way. It exists in your brain in a certain way, and you're not in the world of your garden, your neighbors. One of the problems right now, I think, with climate change is that when you go into that world, and we go into that world more when the world is stressful because it's stressful to be in the other world. So we look at this because it's kind of calming in a certain way. But I think with climate change, we're facing this problem that people are not actually living in that world. I think of the time before there was cell phones and what it was like to get up in the morning. You kind of look around and see the weather and how's the day today. So it's really we're changing these deep neurological patternings that were never there before. Plus, what does the cell phone do or the screens do? They tie into this fight or flight nervous system, all these flashing lights, danger, warning, new things running across the screen. And it's exhausting for the brain. Because, say, if you're a hunter gatherer, you're out hunting food, well, most of the day, nothing's happening. And then something's coming out of your peripheral vision that you have to attend to. But it wasn't this kind of hyper editing, flashing screens, and bells going off all the time. And it's just exhausting for people. If you think about the brain as marrow, every time an impulse comes into the brain, it depletes yin a little bit. So if you're staring at screens where they're going, or like video games or things like that, it's exhausting. What we see with younger people today is that their brains are exhausted and their kidney systems are exhausted, and they have dark circles under their eyes, which are those signs of the kidney deficiency. Um, and it's not going to be so pretty when we age. So we're trying to navigate this. And as I say, it's not that we're doing anything wrong because everything we're doing is based on a natural pattern. Our tendency to use resources, to make cell phones, to make social media, it's all based on natural patterns too. It's just that we're very young at this and we don't know the operating system. So we don't really know what's happening, and we quickly need to get wiser and again retell stories that have heart-based meanings that can organize information and not just gather information. And that's so these are all tied into the questions about brain functioning. It gives it a context in a certain way. If you and I don't want to drag on, but if you look at how brains work versus how your heart works, so your heart is comparing resonances of meaning essentially in the traditional way. Your brain is just making connections. you
Mm.
know that's how brains work. If you use it, fire it, wire it, essentially, in the basic version. So it's more, we don't want to say it's like a computer, it's not quite like that, but it is the same in terms of it makes connections about things.
There's
And
some
that
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. There's some interesting distinctions though there because I'm always like thinking about things in terms of what the left brain does and what the right brain does. Um, and then also the neural control of the heart, which is also very interesting. And it's again not at all at odds with what you're saying. Um, when you talk about making connections, what's interesting is that the left hemisphere has more connections within it. The right hemisphere has more connections uh, sort of across to the left hemisphere, but it's also the hemisphere that's more connected to nature and to others. So it's, like where's your connection, right? Like what are you connecting to? So that's one interesting thing. And then another interesting aspect, I suppose it's not focused so much on these kind of deeper dimensional aspects of um, the heart, but I've also been kind of long fascinated with how the brain controls the heart, partly because I'm overcoming a dysautonomia. A lot of my patients have dysautonomias, but I'm seeing kind of how common it is now that it's a you know 15-bit word that like basically like everyone's having, people's brain stems are stressed, but one interesting aspect of this is that the nerves that are coming out of the brain and the brainstem, they're mainly paired, right, left and right. They're not equally symmetrical, just like really very little in our body is when you think about it. It's symmetrical, but it's asymmetrical, right? We've got a heart that's kind of off to the side, and then our lungs. We've got three lobes on the right, and we've got two lobes on the left, and we've got one liver, and it's kind of going across. And then the kidneys they're different sizes. The adrenal glands are kind of different shapes. It's sort of interesting. One's like pointy, one's flatter. They're at different levels. So we kind of, I don't know, this doesn't get emphasized very much, but the same is true for the brain. And so we have a left and right aspect to our heart. And there's a preferential innervation, kind of a soft specialization of the left and right brain to the heart. What does that mean? It's not 100%. It's not like the left does this and the right does that. But what makes our heart contract is more innervated from one side, and so there's this asymmetry. And so what comes up then is that the more I become aware of different, let's say, imbalances that people may have. Imbalances. No, imbalances. Without saying that whether that's good or bad, right? There's usually a negative connotation. Let's just say that they're not equal. Um, then that has a direct effect on our heart. And where this becomes like a particularly good example of this is in bipolar disorder, which is now understood to be an issue of improper lateralization in the brain, which most developmental neurological issues are. Bipolar disorder is not usually thought of as a developmental disorder, but it is. It emerges later in life, but you can find um, strong evidence of uh, differences in motor activity when they're infants and when they're children. And there's a particular nucleus in the brain that's near the hypothalamus. And that nucleus, which I think from a Neijing perspective is very interesting, is involved in helping us switch between dominance of left and right hemisphere. So it's helping with that breath motion of the hemispheres. And that cycle, like all these other embedded cycles, it happens as we breathe. It happens if we focus on different nostrils. It happens every 90 minutes. And then it happens throughout the day, that you'd have a more of a left hemisphere dominance, relatively speaking, during the day, and a right hemisphere dominance, relatively speaking, at night. And so folks who have bipolar disorder, that nucleus is kind of maybe a little bit sticky, right? So they're getting stuck in activation of one hemisphere, followed by, like, usually the left hemisphere is going to be associated with mania, then followed by a crash in activation of the right hemisphere. But why is that interesting from the heart? That among, if you're at all kind of knowledgeable about this area, like, a lot of people are aware that people with bipolar disorder are likely to die younger, often due to things like overdose or suicide. But what's at least as big of a risk, if not a bigger risk, is sudden cardiac death. People with bipolar disorder are just, what's one of the most common causes of someone just dropping dead because their heart stops. And that's been, the research has been controlling for things like medication use and controlling for things like substance use. But ultimately, the way I explain that is, look, that, the heart is getting, differential input from the left and right sides of the brain. And so if that's, if we have a situation where one side of the brain is doing this and the other side's doing that, then that is going to affect the heart, especially over time. And in the case of a bipolar disorder, where it's specifically affecting the ability to switch between these two sides, usually it has more of a left hemisphere dominance associated with it. Then eventually the heart just, in someone who's relatively young, will just stop.
I have to let the cat out. One second. Well, that's fascinating. Let me ask you this question. If we go back to talking about immersive existence versus name-based, thing-based world, is it overly simplistic to say that our right brain is older in a way, or functions to mirror that aspect versus our left brain?
Okay, how am
I
I
have
going
a
to answer?
I have a feeling that's going to be a little oversimplistic, but
Okay, this is how I'm going to answer it. Um, I'm going to say no, not older. So we have an immersive experience, but then we've got the Homo sapiens sapiens, the self-referential, self-awareness aspect. So I Well, no, hold on. Now I'm going to contradict myself. Okay. I'm going to, because I've got like competing answers coming out. Okay. Let me give you a couple of answers to that. So, one is that um, I don't think that's accurate in the sense that while the right hemisphere is more non-verbal immersive awareness, so animals are also nonverbal, so there's like a different type of nonverbal, right? And that's where we get to this like kind of level of
and animals have language too,
animals do have language too,
like
absolutely.
whales, but it's not word based.
It's not word based, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So so when we look at what is older, then we'll just look at our tree. So things that are below are older, and things that are more central are older. That's like our general rule of thumb. But within that, there does seem to be branching, and I think the right branching happens first. So we're talking about on different timescales here. So on an evolutionary timescale, bottom up, middle out. But as we go out, right goes out a little bit before left. So in a human, the right brain is developing more in utero and in the first 2 years. And then the left comes online, and we get, saying no to mommy and daddy, and we get more development of language, and we get all of this stuff. And our individual development mirrors our evolutionary development. So, ontology follows phylogeny, or whatever that quote is. That, but it's all that means is that we
It
start off
can't,
as a fish.
so it can't mean that your right brain developed and you had a hole in the left side of your skull. It's like with symmetry, they kind of develop more or less at the same time, or they have sequences, but like one develops earlier. How about this? Another principle of nature's design is that the natural orientation is south. It means everything that can faces the sun, and that things rise on your left, so that the early morning, the rising, the yang is on the left, and the going back to night and back to the source is on your right. And so, could it be that the brain is developing out of these midline structures, but then its qualities versus left, right, east, west are differentiating, like, for example, on the left side to where you now get language and words or something, and self-referential awareness. If you remember, also, like in the daytime when it's rising, things are, in terms of transformation, they're coming into being, and we give them names. For example, in the nighttime, things are dissolving so
Hmm.
that they can be reformed around a new embryo of breath. So it's like you would think that the thing-based world is more on the left, on the right. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing out ideas here.
No, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's fun. Again, questions, not answers. These are things that I think about a lot, because you have these clear specializations within the brain. And there's a lot of cross control, especially for these outer structures. So, about 90% of the output of the right brain is going to be in the conscious control and sensation of the left side of the body, and vice versa. There are some things that go up the same side, so it's not, again, not 100%, but it's like these general trends of how things work are seem to be accurate. So, for example, our verbal language is usually for most people housed in the left hemisphere, but what's super important for that as well is the right cerebellum.
Mm.
So,
And
so
this goes into the crossing effect. Why is it that the brain has these special crossings, which the Neijing does write about? It talks about how there's crossing in the eye system, for example.
oh, you're going to have to point me in the direction of that passage, please.
Right. So they got that. And why would that be there, but we don't see it in other places? And one of the reasons is how breath works. So if you look at, yin yang theory, which is breath theory, essentially, it says that whenever you see something, it's I have to get rid of the cat here just a second. She clearly has a brain of her own. Um, so when we look at breath theory, which is really yin yang theory, we can call it yin yang theory. One of the ideas is whenever we see something, it's never the thing itself, it's always the thing and its opposite too. So breath means like if we take the idea of expanding and contracting, it means when there's an emotion of expansion, within that is a seed of contraction, which turns it back around. So, and we see that in the kidney system. It's that if you look at the Tao the Tai Chi symbol, for example, and you see that there's kind of a drop, which is the motion one way, then there's a spot in the middle, which is its opposite. So it means in the deepest part of the system, there's a reversal. And that's why we say maybe the most parts of the body are the spring rising sign on the left, but the kidneys are opposite, you know, and the brain, it's reversed in a certain way. I don't know. Is that
I mean, I think it's it's still a question. Like it's a question I'm again that it's like I'm percolating on, and about these relationships of what's described in the Neijing. Because what's very clear to me, I hope you might think I've jumped to a conclusion here. What's very clear to me is that when you talk about the characteristics of the left hemisphere, a lot of it has a very strong overlap with Eastern direction qualities, like one that you don't have to look for. You know, when you are describing the characteristics of the Eastern direction, you could be describing what the left hemisphere does in the body. You
like
know,
the sun is rising, things are coming into existence, you're giving them names.
yeah, and going from point A to point B, this kind of towards direction,
Right.
the separate identity, like the Jing, kind of the wave separating from the ocean and coming in and being like, I'm, this is all very clearly left hemisphere components. So there is that strong relationship there. And then in terms of this crossing in the body, one thing that you've reminded me of, because I was mentioning earlier that I'm like learning things, especially like in the last little while, where I'm like, how do I not already know this? How is this not common knowledge? How is this not on the first day? And one of those things, and maybe it's just me. Maybe everyone else knows it and I don't. Who knows? But one of the things that was just I couldn't believe I was like today years old and I'm learning this is that in Chinese medicine and TCM, and in different styles. And kind of would ask for a refresher on the Neijing approach. Is that it's not super uncommon to treat a body part by using its opposite. So if there's like a right shoulder problem, you might use a left hip. Um, and that's something that happens, and that's something that seems to work well, depending on what's going on. But I had never come across any sort of non-Chinese medicine explanation for why that might make sense. Sometimes people I was laughing kind of realizing this. Sometimes people will kind of say like because embryology in a way that a lot of people say because quantum physics, and this kind of like they don't necessarily know anything about embryology. It just seems like it might be able to explain weird things because we started off as one cell. um, but what I was recently learning about are these locomotor integration regions that as these cross contralateral bipeds, that when we human one thing that makes humans somewhat unique is that we walk on two legs, and that seems to have happened in tandem with the expansion of our cerebellum and our prefrontal cortex, interestingly, that when we walk, if we put our left foot forward, our right arm swings forward. And that's an unconscious thing that happens. And there are specific nuclei in the brainstem and also on the spinal cord where that happens. So we've got muscles in like our right arm, we've got muscles in our left leg. We can move them independently and consciously. Like I can just move this, and that's a separate thing. But when they're moving together, when I'm walking, when I'm not thinking about it, those impulses, those sensory motor information has to come together into one instruction that's coordinating movement across this organism so that I can walk efficiently and not fall down. And so to me, that's like, holy crap, that's a neurological explanation as to why putting a needle or doing a technique or something on the left shoulder could and should affect the right. I'm sorry, right. I'm looking at the screen. My right shoulder, my left hip. But I did a PubMed search of acupuncture and like neural integration region and got zero hits. That it's never been discussed as far as I could see as an anatomical or physiological explanation as to why using mirroring makes any sort of sense if you're not an acupuncturist.
Yeah, we use mirroring all the time, and one of the main concepts in the Neijing is the lowest way to practice medicine is to look at the area that's hurting. It's called the form. The lower way looks at the form where it's red, inflamed, hurting. The higher way looks at what? The light, which means how light is flowing through blood, and the mechanism, which means the breath. So if you go back to like the blue zone living where people are kind of walking up steps and everything, all of these things are happening, but their body is a coherence that it kind of integrates in. Whereas if you sit and look at a screen all day, that coherence integration kind of gets lost. So, yeah, I think there's a lot there. What are we going to do with all this information? We need
Well,
to
I
have
don't know. It
our
needs to
next
kind of get
podcast.
out and like worked with, and
I'm
it's
so I'm so excited about the work you're doing about how to heal the early nervous system and work from the root back up. I think that's just going to be revolutionary, and it's just getting started. But for now, it's also you see the power of story again, which we talked about before, which is if the story is that you are your brain, you know, that leads to all sorts of different conclusions. It's like the concept we talked about in the beginning, Zheng Ming, correct naming. And if you get the initial story wrong, all sorts of things go wrong, which is hard to recover from. So that's why we spend so much time trying to get the first use of words and the first understanding. Your brain is like, it develops like a tree, just like in nature and so forth. Then we have a story and context. We can build generations of research and knowledge.
absolutely.
So I think we need to have another podcast just entitled, What is Mel Learning?
Perhaps. Well, I was threatened that if I ever do a solo podcast, it'll be called Mel Ruins Everything.
I never get
Because
the sense you're ruining anything,
oh,
Mel.
no, well, I will use the problem is that the lens I tend to view things through is, like, seeing how what someone's doing is, like, slowly killing them. So then it's like, "Oh, yeah, no, you don't wanna do that. Yeah, that's bad. Yeah, taking collagen supplements will deplete your serotonin and wearing AirPods will microwave your brain, and so that's usually the ongoing joke about people who are lucky enough to spend time with me on a regular basis would definitely agree with that title.
I think people are hungry for this. Everybody knows things are not working. Even the neuroscientists, the researchers know this to a certain degree. I think real scientists, they ask questions versus finding it. The questions are more important. Science is a way of questioning. So any real scientist, healthcare person, they're going to be interested in this. I think maybe I'm
Mm.
naive, but
Well, but just it's like you say, you want to build something really beautiful and healthy, and then people can come. One of the this seems like we're starting another topic, but I had wanted to run this by you. I wanted it to come into your field of awareness because it seems so important from a Neijing mapping perspective that I was like, how am I just learning about this? Which is this, because one of the kind of many things that you've put together is understanding that when we're talking about the river systems of the body and we're talking about these kind of directional motions in three-dimensional space, and you talk about how you were looking at a field of sunflowers, the tournesol, and you could see them moving and following the sun, and you can map that onto the activation of the sinew system. And so that's really specific. So here's what I learned. And so this is like I wanted to tell you this in case maybe you already know, and then we can move it forward, which is that at the root of the nervous system, so you have your spinal cord, and then you have your brain stem and your cerebellum. And the brain stem is usually looked at in three sections. So we'll just say lower, middle, and upper. And then the brain is on top of that. And the cerebellum grows out of the middle part. So apparently, the lower and upper parts of the brainstem control the anterior muscles of moving forward, and the middle of the brainstem and the cerebellum are in charge of extension. So flexion and extension with these brainstem regions in the cerebellum. That blew my mind. I have been studying models of health. I mean, not as long as you have, but long enough, thirstily, hungrily, and treating patients. And I'm like, how am I just learning about this? So I know that when you look at someone and how they move and what their posture is like, you get a huge amount of information. And I'm just starting to learn about how to decode that from like a gait perspective and a movement perspective. But that you can literally look at someone and get really specific and accurate information about their cerebellum and their midbrain, these are areas that house our kind of most foundational vital structures. It just
So
blew
that
my
like yeah, and the motions of the body. So you're supposed to be moving in three-dimensional space in this environment. This is oriented around the sun a lot. And the strongest outer motion that we see is flexion and extension. Like when the sun rises, things go like this, and when the sun sets, things go like that. That's really the strongest motion you'll see in relationship to the sun on the outside of the body. So now when patients walk in, the first thing we have them do is like flex into a ball and extend, and then turn side to side and do some other things. And that tells us like right away, like what action in relationship to nature and the sun is working, which one is not. And so it's just so simple and so immensely powerful. And honestly, that's often what we fix as a preparing the root step. Like if someone is like can't flex because of a thing, we'll often fix the thing before we even proceed with the treatment, because
mm.
just getting that motion back in helps so many things. So
But the connections are endless. Like that's you're talking about. If you improve that, then you've improved their like
oh,
autonomic control of their hearts.
so many. That's why they're called preparing
You
the
can
root.
improve their eyesight that way. That's not an exaggeration. You can it's like kind
And
of it's just nuts.
it's so simple. It's almost too simple. People think it's too simple, but it is that strong. And don't forget, like we're saying, the root of the brain is the brainstem and the cerebellum. Well, actually, no. In Chinese thinking, roots are fractal. So the root is actually in the organ level is your kidneys, and in the body level, it's your pelvis, and in the pelvis, it's your family line generation. Do you know? So actually, when someone comes in with Alzheimer's or something, we're not just treating brain points. We actually start at the root of your body, because the brain is actually an upper expression of the kidney. Like in Chinese medicine, how the skin is the outer lungs. So when you feel the skin, you're feeling the lungs. It's the same with the brain. When you're looking at the brain, you're actually looking at the upper kidneys in a certain way. So we start down below and then work our way up. And
This is
then
gonna this is gonna tie into the Neijing nature-based vestibular anatomy because
and then there's the do my, which is pretty much a mess in every modern person. And the duma you can think of as a large marrow with blood vessels all around it, encased in a spinal cord, and you can think of it as a yang reservoir. So any kind of, besides the brain laterality, any kind of issue like ADHD, hyperactivity, autism, things like that, almost always there's a problem in the yang reservoir. When you see this kind of like kind of stuff where the yang is entrapped, it's very often in the yang reservoir. And this is even before we get to treatment of cancer or any other issue. These are called preparing the ground issues, which means they're so fundamental. We're going to stop and work on them before, if we can, before anything else, because they're going to disrupt every other thing we do.
And when you do that, and a lot of people, you
And
resolve.
they're done. That's the problem, is you actually never get to the treatment because you actually fixed it all in that. Yeah.
Mm, very cool.
I think we're kind of at the begin at the just the very beginning of this stuff. Oh my gosh. We're kind of running a race between the insanity of AI and cell phones and things, and
Yeah.
people's and changes of resonance spaces, which is a whole nother topic.
Blade Runner. Very cool. Well, we'll leave it there. This has been, I mean, selfishly, this has been very fun for me because I get to ask you these questions. So,
Oh, and we just touched the edge of it. Let's name another one. Mel ruins everything. We
okay.
could do that. Yeah,
Yeah,
we
that'll be
could.
my, that's my solo offshoot. All right. Well, thank you for the conversation. I look forward to the
Oh,
next
thank
one.
you. I love these conversations. They're great. I'll see you next time.
See you next time.